Howdy and welcome back to Monster Watch. In this episode, we are going to look at a lesser-known bunch of evil scientists from World War II. You know they had to be bad when Slayer makes a song about them. Unit 731. When we think of the horrors of World War II, we often focus on what the Germans did in their infamous concentration camps, but they were by no means alone. Atrocities were committed by both sides, with whole cities being leveled along with their civilian population, and Japan was no different. Unit 731 was a research group based in occupied northeast China. At the absolute least, thousands of people met their ends in horrific experiments at their hands, and hundreds of thousands would lose their lives as a direct result of the biological weapons developed by 731. Prisoners were injected with diseases, given STDs, and deprived of food and water, then vivisected to study how their bodies would deteriorate when left untreated. Limbs were amputated or organs taken out, such as one case where the stomach was removed and the esophagus was connected directly to the intestines. One of the most infamous experiments involved prisoners being frozen to study frostbite, and some had their limbs shattered. As the war drew to a close, prisoners were executed to hide what had been done, leaving no known survivors. But even after records and accounts of their activities were made public, many of the scientists of 731 were recruited by Allied countries. After seeing the horrific effects of scientific advancement in the First World War, the Geneva Convention outlined a few acts that were deemed war crimes and could not be used in battle. But the idea of a war crime is a bit bizarre. After all, if a country is at war, what wouldn't it do to win? When German biological weapons were banned in 1925, military leaders in Japan assumed that such weapons must be quite effective and developed an interest in them. Even before what would become known as World War II broke out in Europe in the 1930s, they would start multiple research and development teams to examine this new way to wage war. In 1931, the Japanese military had staged a false flag by detonating some explosives beside their railroad in Manchuria, China. They then used this bombing as an excuse to invade the region. They would set up a puppet state called Manchukuo in northeast China. The lie that led to the invasion was soon exposed, resulting in Japan's diplomatic ties with the League of Nations to falter and their eventual withdrawal from the predecessor of the UN. Even with the world looking down on the invasion, Japan was able to take control of a large portion of China, and there are countless stories of the atrocities that occurred during this time. It was during this occupation that a research and development unit was created to study disease and biological weapons. Dr. Shiro Ishii had been petitioning the government to do just this since 1930. He had started his research at the immunology department of the Tokyo Army Medical College. The stated goal was to better protect Japanese soldiers from disease, but the real aim was to develop ways of spreading epidemics against the enemies of the empire. Starting with animal test subjects, Ishii wanted to experiment with human subjects to test his theories, but being in the capital constrained him, and so he moved to the recently captured Manchuria. The location that they chose was a village called Baiyin. The military moved in and expelled the inhabitants, then burned down their homes and began construction on a prison camp. This camp and the labs associated with it would become known as the Zongma Fortress, and the life expectancy for the human test subjects was just around a month. In 1934, around 40 prisoners escaped, and while most were either recaptured or succumbed to the elements, the survivors detailed the horrors of what had been done to the prisoners. Some inmates had blood drained over the course of days, and their condition documented as they deteriorated. Nutrient and water deprivation was another common practice. Others were injected with diseases, and were then studied up to and including being dissected alive to see how their organs reacted to the illness. Despite information about the barbaric experiments getting out, there was no major international outrage, and the Chinese government was unable to do much as large portions of their country was occupied by Imperial Japan. Even so, Ishii was not happy with the publicity and moved his experiments to Pingfang in 1935. This is where the name Unit 731 was adopted and the brutality escalated. Test subjects were simply taken from the streets and shipped to the prison labs. They might have heard rumors of what went on in Pingfang, but there was no way to prepare them for what was about to happen. They were referred to as maruto, or logs, and were subjected to a huge range of atrocities. There was weapons testing to see the effects of swords, knives, bayonets, flamethrowers, firearms, and other weapons. Victims were sometimes tied to a post and grenades detonated at various distances to test the lethality of the shrapnel. These experiments had a dual purpose. Not only would they learn the efficacy of the weapons used, but the doctors could also develop the best ways to treat the subsequent wounds. The disease testing had also continued, and there were reports of plagues being intentionally spread on Chinese cities and villages to see what would happen and how effective they were as a weapon. Fleas were bred in the labs that were infected with the bubonic plague and dropped from planes on multiple cities in China, including Ningbo and Changde in Hunan province, leading to a huge number of fatalities. Typhoid fever and the variant paratyphoid was also intentionally spread by infecting water sources and food that was then distributed to the civilian population. But they did not stop there. Biological weapons was the primary focus of 731, and it is reported that there were at least 12 large-scale tests conducted in 11 cities across China. One of the most devastating was the 1941 attack on Nangdi, which resulted in 10,000 Chinese casualties and almost 2,000 Japanese soldiers who did not use adequate protection. Near the end of World War II, the Japanese Navy began planning on using these biological weapons on America. The mission was codenamed Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, but thankfully this plan was scrapped in 1945. Interestingly, the man who was responsible for calling it off, General Hideki Tojo, would be hanged by the United States after the war. But this is not to say that biological weapons were not used on the United States. Balloons with toxic payloads were floated over the Pacific Ocean, though they were not very effective as very few actually made it to their destination. But at least 7 Americans lost their lives to these balloons, though this was kept quiet from the American public to avoid mass hysteria. All the while, the horrific and evil experiments continued in the lab. Prisoners were often vivisected or operated on while alive and conscious to examine the effects of the experiments that they had been subjected to and how the body would react if organs were removed, such as the removal of the stomach and attaching the esophagus directly to the intestines. A former member of Unit 731, Okawa Fukumatsu, would give a filmed interview where he described vivisecting a pregnant woman and admitted to personally taking thousands of lives during his time with 731. Some of the most well-known experiments were conducted by Yoshimura Hosato. These tests involved the subjects being submerged in a bath of ice and water or left outside in freezing temperatures to see how long it would take for them to get frostbite, and then determine the best treatment. Limbs were frozen solid and were said to have sounded like a wooden board when struck. The results of these experiments led to the determination that the best course of action for frostbite is to submerge the affected body part in water between 100 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still the standard today. There were also experiments with heat, where dehydrated prisoners were put in front of heated fans, and one report said that at the time they lost their lives, they had essentially been mummified alive and weighed as little as 1/5 what they had weighed before the process began. Along with the studies of diseases and environmental effects of hot and cold, STDs were also tested. Horrifyingly, women were impregnated by guards then infected with the disease, primarily syphilis, to see whether their children would be born with it. Disgustingly, guards assaulting female inmates was common, and the children were then used in other experiments. One account described a test where they determined how long it would take for a 3-day-old baby to freeze to death. Remember that there are no known survivors of Unit 731, children or otherwise, so there was no discrimination even if the subjects were infants. Some of the experiments were even more outlandish and did not seem to serve any real purpose, such as limbs being removed and reattached on the opposite side, prisoners being put into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped, or loaded into massive centrifuges, then spun until they passed away. These procedures seemed more aimed at cruelty and sadism rather than the unethical attempt at answering questions about the human body, unlike many of the other disgusting experiments conducted. The victims of Unit 731 were not strictly Chinese civilians. Many dissidents from Japan and Allied soldiers captured in the war found themselves in the hands of the evil scientists. They included Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, as well as Japanese criminals and people who were mentally disabled, much like what happened in the German camps. Some people who had worked for Unit 731 reported seeing British, French, and Americans as well among the inmates. And staff was not protected. When Yoshio Sudo was infected with the bubonic plague accidentally, He ceased to be a guard and found himself under the knife as he was vivisected to see how his internal organs were reacting to the horrific disease. Whether the order to carry this procedure out was obeyed out of fear or indifference, there's no way to know, but by 1945 the war was coming to an end. Russia and the Soviet Union had been involved in wars with Japan for decades, and in August, with Germany surrendering, they once again set their sights on the island empire. On August 6th and 9th, the US dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, making it clear that the war was drawing to a rapid close. In an attempt to hide what had been done, Unit 731 began liquidating the prisoners who were still alive and destroying the camp records. The experimentation had continued right up to the end of the war, but with the Soviet Union approaching in August of 1945, the guards worked quickly to execute the 300 living inmates currently inside the Pingfang facility using gas or cyanide. Hundreds of Chinese locals who had worked as laborers were also shot and the records destroyed. Cyanide tablets were handed out to the members of Unit 731, and they were told to take the secrets of what they had done to the grave. Before the last of them left, they blew up the prison camp and disappeared. Meanwhile, a man named Murray Sanders arrived in Japan. He was a lieutenant colonel in the American military and a microbiologist. He had been sent to investigate Japan's biological weapons during the war. After initial attempts at interrogating the Japanese prisoners failed, he eventually resorted to threatening them that he would hand them over to the Soviets, who were notoriously cruel and their prisons exceedingly harsh. This tactic worked, and he soon had a detailed description of much of the weapons experimentation that had gone on in the Empire, including Unit 731, which was only one of several biological warfare research groups. The Allied response to this information was quite questionable. When General MacArthur was presented with the information, he offered the scientists of Unit 731 immunity, including Shiro Ishii. In exchange, they wanted exclusive access to the findings of the heinous experiments. Tensions were already rising between the US and the Soviet Union, and MacArthur thought that this research could be a great benefit in future conflicts. Nearly all of the horrors of Unit 731 were kept secret from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, much to the dismay of the judges when the truth surfaced years later. But the Soviets were not so willing to let the war crimes go unpunished. Some of the leaders of the Japanese military and top scientists from 731 and the similar units 1644 and 100 were shipped for trial in Russia. Their trials began in December of 1949 and resulted in the criminals being sentenced to work in Siberian labor camps. It should be noted that these punishments were unusually lenient, and all but 2 of those tried were back in Japan by the 1950s. Like the Americans, Moscow saw the research as a strong jumping-off point for their own biological weapons development, and in return, the scientists were given light sentences. The transcripts of these trials were translated into several languages and sent around the world. The American government claimed that the trials and the transcripts were simply communist propaganda meant to distract from the Soviets' brutal treatment of their own POWs. What is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the deal that the US struck with Unit 731 was that the testing and experimentation did not stop with the war. Well into the 1950s and perhaps beyond, members of Unit 731 and 1644 experimented on Japanese prisoners, babies, and the mentally ill, secretly funded by the US military. In 1950, the former members of the biological weapons group started a blood bank and a pharmaceutical company called Green Cross, for which Murray Sanders acted as a consultant, likely as a way to funnel him cash in return for his silence. The blood bank would come under fire in the 1980s after patients using blood supplied from them contracted HIV. It is shocking that the scientists who had used humans as lab rats did not face any real consequences for their crimes. But what happened to the mastermind of Unit 731? Shiro Ishii received full immunity and never saw the inside of a prison cell. Instead, he moved back to Tokyo and opened a clinic, providing free exams and treatments. But he would also help the US military during the Korean War, leading to allegations that the US had used biological weapons in the conflict. On October 9, 1959, Shiro Ishii passed away of cancer at 67 years old after facing no real consequences for his heinous actions.